I have Dr. Sylvie Condi, who is my colleague at SUNY Old Westbury here. Dr. Condi is a Sorbonne-trained scholar who holds a master's in classics and a PhD in African history. Her dissertation revolves around Creole architecture in Sierra Leone, and she is going to publish an essay on this topic for the forthcoming 9th volume of the UNESCO General History of Africa. She's also a founding member of a group who works on the restoration of the public archives in Sierra Leone and received a Prince Claus grant for that purpose. She's a member of the honor committee of the Fondation Gorée Almidies in Senegal, who works on the philosophy and content of the memorial to be erected to commemorate the victims of the transatlantic slave trade. And she's also the author of 3 collections of poetry published by Gallimard. One of them was just published actually in a bilingual edition with English translation by Wesleyan University Press. So that's exciting for us at Old Westbury. And she's an associate professor at SUNY Old Westbury. I also have here Alia Mosalem, who is a fellow at the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation in Berlin. Alia was trained at the London School of Economics, I believe, right? But she's originally from Egypt. And I met with Alia actually when I was first starting this program back in 2015, this research project. Her work actually on a play called Hoa El Hareya was really sort of inspirational for me in making this project happen. So I'm really excited to have Alia here. She's also written a handful of articles about the Egyptian Labor Corps and book chapters as well. So I think she's going to have a lot of really interesting things to say about the topic. And then I also invited Robert Vitalis to join us today. Bob is actually originally from the New York City area, right? And got his bachelor's at Stony Brook. Is that correct?
Yes.
And now he's a professor at UPenn in Philadelphia. And he's written some amazing books. I read his book about Egyptian capitalism when capitalists collide when I was in grad school. But since then, he's really expanded his research approach. And he's published books about Saudi Arabia and the Aramco labor camps that were being constructed. That's the America's Kingdom book, which was super influential for me as I wrote this book, and also has a new book out called Oilcraft, which is about myths regarding energy policy and security in the United States foreign policy establishment. So I've invited these 3 folks here. What we're going to do real quick is I'm just going to start by telling you a little bit about the book and about what I have done in terms of my research. And then I'm going to read a short portion of the book. And then I'm going to turn it over to, I guess we can start with Alia. Is that okay, Alia? We start with you.
Sure, yeah.
And then we can move on to Sylvie, and then we can have Bob at the end. You know, I'll respond to their comments or questions, and then we'll open it up to anyone else who wants to ask any questions. So let me start just by sharing some images I have here of the Egyptian Labor Corps, because these images, you know, they tend to be very affecting when people see these images. So this is kind of the first image that I think is interesting. It really gives you a sense of the scope. You know, in the book, I estimate that there were 500,000 Egyptians recruited for the Egyptian Labor Corps. So this is a company of ELC men in Boulogne in France that as they just arrived. And so I'll read a portion of the book and I'll show some pictures as I read. So this book tells the forgotten story of the Egyptian Labor Corps, or the ELC for short. During the First World War, the British imposed martial law in Egypt and recruited approximately 500,000 young men, mostly fellahin from the rural countryside, and many by force against their will, to serve as military laborers in Europe and the Middle East. They worked as stevedores on the docks of France and Italy, And that's why I've included this picture here. This shows the men unloading supplies from a ship on the docks of Boulogne. And this is before the invention of the shipping container. So everything had to be moved and hauled by hand. It was a very labor-intensive job. But that's not all that Egyptians did in the First World War. They also drove camels laden with supplies. And I have an image here of two Egyptian camel drivers. And this is in the Palestine front, because the only way to travel to Palestine when World War I began from Egypt was on camel across the Sinai. Of course, the ELC eventually built a railway that connected Egypt and Palestine, and you can see that railway kind of in the background here. But while the railway was being built, anything that had to be moved ahead of the railway had to be moved by camel. And it wasn't just in the Sinai that Egyptians drove camels. It was also in the Western Desert, in the war against the Senussi forces in Libya, and down in Sudan as well, in the campaign in Darfur against Ali ibn Dinar. Egyptians also actually served as a police force in occupied Baghdad after the British occupied Baghdad. But it was in the advance through Palestine into Syria, which was the second largest theater of the First World War, that the ELC provided the bulk of the military labor force. And as I mentioned before, they laid hundreds of miles of railway and water pipeline connecting Egypt and Palestine. And I think this is really probably their most important contribution that they made, because this became the infrastructural foundations of the British Empire in the Middle East during the interwar period. So the Egyptian Labor Corps, my book, it documents the experiences of these men in the war, and it follows them through to the Egyptian Revolution of 1919. But most importantly, I think it analyzes how they influenced and were also influenced by contemporary ideas about the racial identity of Egyptians. So race, I found when I looked through the sources, was really a crucial lens through which both British and Egyptian national authorities viewed the men of the ELC. So for the British imperial authorities, the ELC was just one part of what they called the colored labor corps. And Egyptian workers served alongside others from places as far-flung as China, South Africa, India, Vietnam, the West Indies, Fiji, and even other places too. And this was the clearest example for the world to see, I argue, what African Americans had been recognizing for at least a generation as the color line. In 1881, Frederick Douglass first used this term, the color line, to refer to the system of racial segregation in the American South after the failure of Reconstruction. And it was W.E.B. Du Bois who reformulated this idea of the color line on a global scale, talking about the global color line in a 1900, the year 1900. He gave this address in the 1900 to the American Negro Academy, where he insisted that the color line belts the world, and the social problem of the 20th century will be the relation of the civilized world to what he called the dark races of mankind, right? So my argument in the book is basically that this global color line was made acute during the First World War by the massive movements of racialized laborers that I just described, and that as the war ground on, millions of people, including people in Egypt, who were on the other side of this global color line, resisted the unprecedented imposition of this binary approach to race. But for people living in Egypt, the sight of young men being sent away from their villages to work abroad, and oftentimes these men were bound together by a thick rope wrapped around their trunk. This scene was reminiscent of nothing for Egyptian nationalists, if not slavery. And actually in Egypt, by the second half of the 19th century, there was a long tradition of enslaved people, especially enslaved Black Africans, working in Egypt. And if you were a young enslaved man engaged in hard labor, you were almost guaranteed to be a Black African in Egypt in the late 19th century, right? So even after slavery was officially abolished in 1877, it persisted surreptitiously, along with a link between Blackness, African origins, and enslavement in Egyptian popular culture. So one of the things I argue in the book is that when urbane, educated Egyptian nationalists in the cities saw farmers from the countryside, whom they had over the over the decades previous to that, come to perceive as almost the repository of Egyptian national authenticity or Egyptianness. The Arabic word here is Misriya. And when they saw these men in a condition akin to slavery, they understood how Egyptians had been racialized as people of color alongside Black Africans during the war. So I argued that the 1919 revolution should be seen partly as an attempt to articulate an alternative conception of Egyptian racial identity, which I call racial nationalism, in response to this in the book. So that's basically the main argument of the book. And what I was hoping we could do now is turn it over to Alia and then Sylvie and then Bob and hear your thoughts and maybe any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Kyle. Again, Alf Mabruk, congratulations. This book was a long time in the making, I guess, since the beginning of the PhD. It brings in a lot of sources together, a lot of sounds, a lot of petitions, a lot of images. It evokes a lot of images as well, and a lot of events that you picked up from the different places that the ALC traveled from Egypt through the fronts of war. So I have three areas that I'd like to hear you talk about. The first is this question of how these recurrent protests that you trace that start happening in Egypt in early 1918 in different places, and you mentioned villages like Talha, Faraskour, and also Minya and Asyut. And you talk a lot about how these protests you talk a lot about how the sort of techniques for recruiting the corvée labor shape the sort of politics that result in the 1919 revolution. But my question is, do you feel and how do you feel they might have affected the administration, the colonial administration, this sort of mixed administration or double administration that you talk about? That's a colonial administration, but also the Egyptian Ministry of Interior that was involved in the recruitment. But if you feel that their protesting techniques affected whether the way they administrated the workers on the front, if they responded to that, if they had to change their strategies somehow. That's a question. Another is this question of listening. So there's a chapter where you reconstruct the sort of the sound. I mean, how did it sound on the front? You look at songs, you look at jokes, you look at conversations between the workers, and how they affected how they worked or their relationships with the administration. And you call the chapter listening in on the Egyptian labor course. And I'm curious about that because it's always very tricky to sort of recreate this audio atmosphere, because we're doing it through someone who's actually sometimes spying on the worker. So someone they don't know, but they speak directly to us. But I was very intrigued by this use of listening in, and I'm always very curious about this. I mean, even here in Berlin, people who've worked with the recordings of prisoners of war, they stop at this a lot, at this question of, who are we really listening to, and what are we really getting out of that? And you constructed a soundscape for this. And finally, this petition by the Egyptian Labor Corps. So there is this idea that, and it's recurrent. We see it in several places that the protests and the riots by the returning Egyptian Labor Corps and their communities diverge from the nationalists' objectives of the 1919 revolution. We see it in Ismat Saif ad-Dawla's novel, in memoirs, how Fikri Abdel Nabi and his friend talk about how they're going to actually take advantage of the 1919 revolution and then use the arms to kick the landed gentry out of their lands. We see it in Zainab Abul Magd's book also about how Wafdists were attacked when they visit Inna. They don't see the 1919 revolution as having saved them from anything. On the contrary, and we see it here when you talk about the Egyptian Labor Corps sort of. They're not only diverging, but they're asking the British to stay. We also saw bits of that in the archive, where you have the middle class, you have the molasses. I think it was the molasses sellers who were asked in Minya, who were saying they'd like the British to stay, and a woman that was rewarded for protecting an army officer, I think, during riots. But it was clear on the part of the middle class. But why would the Egyptian, if the Egyptian Labor Corps formed a party? So we're not doubting the authenticity of the document. It's there, like you say. But what narrative could it be contributing to in the archive? It's super intriguing, and it really stands out. And yeah, Mabruk again for bringing all of this together. Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Alia. I think what I might do is have all of you go ahead and lay out your questions, and then I'll deal with them all after that. So I took note of all of those three questions, and maybe now we can move it on to Sylvie, and I'll respond when all three of you are done. So Sylvie?
Okay. So as a member of the History and Philosophy Department at SUNY Old Westbury, I'm very proud that with the publication of this monograph, Kyle, you are in the process of making a name for yourself as a specialist of so far understudies historical agency, that of the ELC. So in my view, this study of great quality and depth rests on two clever strategies. The first one consists in complicating the accepted linear connection between World War I and the anti-colonial Egyptian revolution of 1919 by examining a range of roles played in this connection by the 500,000 men who constituted the ELC. The second strategy that I admired is that Dr. Anderson aligned his main thesis with the interest of today's scholarship, which emphasizes the long forgotten dimension of race in nation building, and even, as he proposes, in the non-Western nationalist ideologies. In this essay, he thus underlines how the ELC came to bear directly and indirectly upon the representation of Egypt in a world divided by the color line. The trans-regional nature of the book, its texture and its emphasis on forced labor and identity makes it an important reading for Middle Eastern studies, African studies, post-colonial studies, subaltern studies, mobility studies, etc., which explains the academic diversity of the panel today. For the sake of time, I will reserve to another discussion some quite fascinating passages of the book, the one that Alia mentioned in particular, this chapter devoted to the soundscape in the ELC camps and the author's examination of oral sources. I would like to just ask two brief questions. Egyptian nationalists who fought British colonialism after World War I in what you call, Kyle, an anti-racist act on page 183, build their argumentation, as you also report, on what they saw as the shocking treatment of Egyptians in ELC, as if they were, and this is the sources, Black slaves or African savages. Thus, my question, what are we to make of a liberation project, be it anti-colonial, anti-imperialist or other, which doesn't carry intrinsically the possibility, not necessarily of a universalist application, but at least of broader geographies of possibilities? I feel that in many ways you answered this question in chapter 9 by showing that the ELC laborers did not buy into the nationalist rhetoric and made their own choices, understanding, as you write, and I quote, that imperialism was a special process that produced racial imaginaries, not a confrontation between objectively existing races in empty space, end of quote. And this is a statement to which I entirely subscribe, and which reflects, I think, the quote that you gave us of Keith Aoki's position at the beginning of the work, but I still notice that this resolution comes at page 212. In addition, I was wondering if the predilection of some Egyptian nationalist thinkers for social Darwinism, and you mentioned Salama Moussa, for instance, who published his book, Egypt, The Origin of Civilization in 1935, and the ancillary stigmatization of sub-Saharan Africans could not be understood as a form of proto-fascism, of which the Waft party itself came to fear the influence. Okay, and my second point, and I will end up with this, in more than one occasion, you made an analogy between American and French societies, ascribing to the latter the equivalent of a set of Jim Crow laws. So this is certainly not to say that colonial troops did not experience racism. In fact, in another paper, you mentioned the work of Taylor Stovall, whose scholarship deals with that issue. But just wanted to point out that because France never had a plantation slavery on metropolitan soil, no segregation system was ever put in place. So I was wondering if you could elaborate on that.
Great. Thanks, Sylvie. I'll definitely address those issues, but let's hear from Bob first, and then I'll address all three of your comments. So Bob, go ahead.
Thank you. You know, it's a gift to me that you've invited me here, and your book is a gift because I'm actually feeling like a kind of impersonator at this point. And let me explain. And back to your claim, starting with the claim that I'm a SUNY graduate. It is true. I graduated from SUNY Stony Brook in 1977. After I took an extra year because in 1976, SUNY sent me to Cairo. This was at a time when no American students were going to Cairo because there were no relations between Egypt and the United States. But the SUNY system, after the 73 war and Kissinger shuttle diplomacy and the reopening of Egyptian ties with the United States, the SUNY system at that time organized the first I said Cairo, I made a mistake, the first fellowships for SUNY students. We went to Alexandria, to the Kulliyat Adab. And so I studied there in 1976. And I don't know whether to love SUNY or hate SUNY for that reason, because it completely changed the trajectory of what I wanted to do. I went to graduate school saying I was going to study Egypt. I lived in, I took a leave of absence from graduate school for 2 years because I entered graduate school the year Orientalism came out. And Orientalism said, you don't go do political science without actually understanding the language and engaging people and making a kind of political commitment. So I actually took time off for 2 years and lived in Cairo at AUC. I went back to do PhD research, and I want to remind us of what it was that progressives were doing then and what the questions are, because those books are in your bibliography. But I was there when those folks were getting their PhDs. I'm thinking of Nathan Brown and the Peasantry. He was there precisely when I was there, and we were good friends as graduate students. And then, of course, my own mentors, Joey Bainan and Zach Lockman, working on workers. So in the late 70s and early 80s, The arguments we were having and the literatures we were reading were atalia. We were engaging with Marxist dependency theory, Samir Amin. And the reason I'm saying this is at no point did I understand the name W.E.B. Du Bois. At no point would Du Bois have ever been evoked as a way of kind of axis for understanding Egypt. Little did I know that David Du Bois was living in Cairo at that time, because Shirley Graham Du Bois, had lived there ever since she was kicked out of Ghana, basically. So it's a sea change. It's this tremendous sea change that we can now take for granted, that Kyle can do the work that he's doing, raising the questions that he's raising, which were just not raised, right? So one of the ways this book is so great is simply by, and not to undermine its accomplishment, but simply by looking at the materials in a new way, or thinking about questions that were never on the minds of at least two cohorts of scholars of Egyptian politics, economy, and so forth that I know about. So to me, it's a gift. I was blown away by the chapter on the 1919 revolution, again, because here's this principal, phenomenon that has driven three, 4 generations of scholarship. And Kyle made me see it in a different way. And the other reason I love this book as he was doing this is because one of my closest friends, Ellis Goldberg, had just died. And I know that Ellis would have been overwhelmed by this book. He would have fought Kyle because he was an ornery kind of guy, but he would have so been moved by the arguments about the 1919 revolution and the labor corps. The labor corps is kind of like being a vanguard part of that, right, in a way. So to me, it's a gift. I could be wrong, right? Aliyah knows the materials that have emerged since. She's worked on it herself, etc. But for me, it was just a revelation. So I love reading this book from page 1 to the end. Now, I only have one question for you. It's okay. So you're going up for tenure. Let's do this anyway. What do you think what is the question you're most dreading? Or put it another way, where does the argument not fall apart, but where does the argument end? Or what are you expecting? Where are you expecting pushback on? Right. So when I wrote the book you evoked, America's Kingdom, far different from Egypt, on Saudi Arabia, I knew what the problem in that book was. And I wrote in the forward, if you think this is the problem in the book, you're wrong. So let's just, do something else. I, of course, didn't write where I thought the argument really was a problem or what I was dreading someone discovering. And so far, the only person who's done that is one of my undergraduates. So I feel okay about that. But for you, I want to ask, what do you how would you critique the book? And I'm doing that, if we're in trouble, I remember this from my general exams, right? And that if you were going to get a question like this, Bob, how does a bill become a law? In graduate school, you knew you were in trouble with your faculty because they were asking you to go from the beginning, right? But if the faculty member kind of challenged you, critiqued you, asked you to, kind of push your arguments, et cetera, you're in pretty good shape, right? And here's this chance. We're just really celebrating you. So I really want to know, where you think the flaws are in some sense. Now, you folks who are working on his tenure package, please just mute or something, okay? But thank you so much. What a gift.
Wow, thank you, Bob, and thanks to all of you for your great comments. I actually think that I can handle Bob's question and Alia's third question about this petition from the Egyptian Labor Corps Party in kind of a similar way, because what Alia's question was, and let me share my screen with you guys so you can see what she's talking about. One of the things I found in the course of my research was this petition from 1921 by what's known as the Egyptian Labor Corps Party, or so they claim. This is literally the only piece of evidence I've been able to find that even substantiates the existence of this party. So that in and of itself is pretty interesting. But I found this in the British archives, right? And what the petition is asking for is, it purports to be from a political party organized by veterans of the Egyptian Labor Corps who are coming together and petitioning kind of, in some senses, they're disagreeing with the nationalists. But I think in a broader sense, and I didn't really talk about this in the book, I think there's also this key portion here where it says that they support the nationalists, right? If they make a couple small tweaks in their program, right? And so I think, the question that we have to ask ourselves as historians is like, what is this doing in the archives? Why have the British decided to hold on to this document and not others, right? And I think that part of what's going on here is that the British are trying to undermine the nationalist claim to represent all of Egypt. The British are trying to fight against Egyptian nationalism, right? And so they produce this document from Egyptians who say, look, there's disagreements. These nationalists that we're negotiating with, they don't actually represent all of Egyptians. And, I think the implication for the British then is that obviously these nationalists should be ignored and not paid attention to, right? So I think that answers Alia's question, right? Alia asked me, what narrative is this document playing in the archives? And that what it's doing is it's undermining the nationalist claim to represent all of Egypt, right? And then so Bob's question is, what is the critique that I'm most dreading, that I'm most expecting to hear from people as they read this book? And I think what I'm most dreading is that people say basically, by questioning the official nationalist narrative of the 1919 revolution, am I just feeding into what the British were trying to do by introducing skepticism into the legitimacy of the claims of the Wafd and the Nationalist Party? So I think what I'm most worried about, and what some people have already sort of said to me, is that I am essentially rehashing British arguments against the 1919 revolution when I do things like claim that the nationalists don't represent everybody in Egypt, or even when I do things like claim that the nationalists have perhaps a fraught relationship with Black Africans, right? One of the big ways that the British, and this is another paradox, I think, of colonialism in Egypt, but one of the big ways that the British kind of got control in Egypt was by campaigning against the African slave trade, right? After the British outlaw slavery, they're able to take this kind of high moral road by looking at countries in Africa that have continued the practice of slavery, and they say, look, you're being uncivilized, you're being barbaric by continuing slavery. And so as British, who have outlawed slavery, we now have to take over your country in order to stamp out the slave trade, right? And slavery is considered to be kind of a unique problem for Muslims at this time, right? And so I think, what I'm concerned about is by calling attention to the legacies of the slave trade and anti-Blackness as it continued throughout Egyptian, as it continued as a strand. It certainly didn't define Egyptian nationalism, but it was, I think, present as a strand of Egyptian nationalism. But when I point that out, I'm basically doing the same thing that the British were doing by, harping on the slave trade as being this barbaric practice that Egyptians continued. So the hard thing that I have to do is kind of walk a fine line here by, I think, being aware that slavery happened, that the afterlives of slavery were relevant to understanding Egyptian nationalism, but also not playing into the British historiography, the British imperial historiography that the British archives are trying to seed by putting documents like this petition in there. And so the way that I've tried to do that, I think, is by, I think I reserve most of my criticism for the British Empire. And I think number one, I think the most important thing I'm trying to do is, as Sylvie mentioned, kind of break down this whole racial imaginary that defines geopolitics at this time, right? What the British are saying is that Egyptians as a species, as a people, are uniquely anti-Black, right? And what I am trying to say is that it's wrong to think about Egyptians as a species, as a unified people at this time, or at least, you know, to the extent that it's helpful, it might be helpful in terms of the nationalist revolution, but it doesn't actually describe what the historical record shows us, right? And so I hope to kind of thread the needle there by being critical of Egyptian nationalism, but also being critical of British imperialism, and fundamentally by hopefully abandoning the sort of premise that humans are organized into relatively homogenous groups naturally that can be called races and that are essentially different from each other, right? So I hope that I accomplished this in this book, but I'm sure that there's a lot of people who are going to be skeptical and who say that I'm reproducing British racism. And it just doesn't help that I'm a white guy from America as I write all this stuff. But honestly, I'm just trying to stick to the sources as I write this. So we'll see how good I did. I guess that's up to you guys. Maybe you should buy a copy of the book and let me know what you think. Okay, let me think about some other potential questions here that were asked. So Alia talked about the protests, how protests that were going on in the countryside affected the colonial administration was kind of the first question that she asked. And I talk about it in the book about how the British ended up reintroducing the corvée. So the corvée was kind of a long-standing institution of forced labor in Egypt. The British abolished it in the 1890s. It was one of their signature kind of moral achievements in leading the Egyptian government. And then, they ended up reintroducing it in World War I because they're trying to present this recruitment as something that's traditional, as something that's in line with what's happened in the past. So I think that's one of the big ways that protest affected the colonial administration, that caused them to basically change their course on the corvée and reintroduce it. When it came to the front, I don't think that protests back at home necessarily impacted decisions on the front that much. And I think we can tell this because, protests were going on from 1918 onwards, and the Egyptian Labor Corps continued all the way until August of 1921, right? So I think that the British are not really, they're not really concerned about the ELC contributing to more protests, but they do react. They're not concerned about the ELC contributing to more protests back at home, back in Egypt, right? But they do respond to protests that happen on the front when the laborers protest in the camps. And I think the biggest place where that happens is in France in 1917, and that there's widespread Egyptian protests. And what that ends up doing is the British end up relocating the Egyptians away from France and moving them back to Palestine once the winter hits. And they basically make the calculation that Egyptians are too unruly to keep in France. So I think, and there, as far as I can tell, those are the only. There were labor corps from China, from Senegal, from the West Indies, and I think the Egyptians were the only ones that were actually moved because of their protesting. When it comes to the listening stuff, and why I focus on songs and jokes and embedded. So, for those of you who don't speak Arabic, there's multiple registers of Arabic, right? And when you're talking about the colloquial language that's spoken kind of on the street in more casual settings, that is what I was looking for when I was going through the British archives and transliterated examples of colloquial Arabic. Because to me, this signals speech, right? And one of the big problems that we have in studying rural Egyptians is that they didn't leave behind a lot of written accounts. They didn't leave behind a lot of biographies. I've seen sources that indicate that they wrote letters, but I haven't been able to find any of the letters. The most that I've been able to find is actually a short memoir written by a veteran of the war. But without these written sources, most historians would find themselves stuck because we depend so much on literary sources as a discipline. But I tried to get around that by looking at oral sources, right? So if these men are not leaving behind written sources, what are they leaving behind? There's records of their speech, there's records of their songs, there's records of the theater that they put on. And so for me, this is kind of a historiographical point I'm trying to make. Like, how do we study people that don't leave behind written accounts? And the point that Alia made is, well, isn't this problematic? Because ultimately the speech is preserved for us in the records of outside observers. And yes, it is problematic, but I think that in some senses, if we can take in mind that the position of these outside observers, what we can actually tell is some interesting facts about the camps themselves, right? So most of these outside observers were white, and one of the things that I find is that they're oftentimes really kind of alienated by what they're seeing at the camp, right? Like the speech is called babble or raucous or too loud or incomprehensible, and the music is called tone deaf and whatever. But I think that what this is, rather than taking those descriptions at face value, I take them more as evidence that these observers were themselves feeling out of place in camp, right? And I call this white alienation. And I basically think that it's the experience that white people have when they've lived in a world that's been set up for them their whole lives, and then they go somewhere where all of a sudden they're in the minority and they have to adjust to everyone else, right? Rather than other people having to adjust to them. And in these camps, a lot of times the officers, it was one officer to like 500 to 1,000 Egyptian workers, right? So they're way outnumbered and they're not speaking English and they're pissed off. They're just ready to be around some other British people, and I think that even though, I think that's one thing we can take from these observations, right? So on the one hand, they don't unproblematically reflect what Egyptians are thinking, but I do think that they can give us a sense of what was going on with the Egyptians at the camp, and they also can tell us a lot about how the white officers were feeling alienated, right? And then to answer some of Sylvie's questions, Sylvie talked about, what are we to make of this Egyptian revolution, which on the one hand is an anti-racist act in the sense that it's an act against white supremacy, right? They're saying that the British should no longer rule over their country, but it's also exclusionary in the sense that Egyptians are trying to articulate what makes themselves unique and distinct and different than Black Africans, right? That they've been grouped next to by having workers recruited for the ELC and by being part of an official protectorate and all these other things. So I think, what we make of this, Sylvie, is that it's very paradoxical and it's very, I think it means that we have to stop thinking about colonialism in a binary framework, right? Of colonizer versus colonized. Eve Trout Powell has this famous description of Egyptians as the colonized colonizers, right? So on the one hand, they're being colonized by the British. On the other hand, they themselves are trying to build an empire of their own in East Africa. And I'm trying to kind of build off of Eve Trout Powell's understanding of colonialism here in my book. And then Sylvie, you also mentioned this quote about Salama Musa and whether it's kind of a proto-fascism in Egypt. And it's very, perceptive that you said that, because Salama Musa himself, out of all the thinkers in interwar Egypt, Salama Musa is probably the one that's most who most warmed to fascism as it was forming in Europe in the 1930s. And for him, he sees eugenics and he sees the National Socialist program as a blueprint for Egyptians themselves to implement within their own country to fight back against British colonialism, right? So it's this sense in which I'm not sure if you call it left-wing eugenics or if you call it right-wing anti-colonialism, but it is a way in which the ideas of race science can be harnessed and used to serve anti-colonial goals. And I think it's hard for us living in 2022 to kind of wrap our heads around this, But if you go back to the pre-World War II era, things looked a lot different, right? And race in particular was everywhere. And the way that people, and it was very influential in the way that people thought about history and society. And after World War II, and we saw the death camps and we saw what Hitler did, we kind of just swept all this stuff under the rug, right? And this is what Toni Morrison talks about in Playing in the Dark, which Bob brings up in America's Kingdom, right? So I think as a discipline, we decided to stop talking about race because Hitler and National Socialism discredited those ideas. But what's resulted is that we have these multiple generations that Bob has talked about that's just ignored white supremacy and anti-blackness in Egypt, I think. So what my work at the moment is trying to do is to bring these analytics back into the fold as we talk about Egypt. And finally, Sylvie's discussion about France and the Jim Crow laws in France. You know, Tyler Stovall, his first book focused on African American veterans who had gone and served in the First World War and then stayed behind in Paris, right? Paris Noir. And for him, what Paris promised the African Americans was a kind of a new future that wasn't going to be based on segregation and wasn't going to be based on slavery. But Stovall realized that the situation for African Americans was different than the situation for colonial workers and troops, because African Americans were seen as being Americans first and foremost. But if you were from Vietnam, or if you were from China, or if you were from India, or if you were from Egypt or Senegal, or any of these other places where people were in France, you were not treated the same way as African Americans. You were segregated, set apart. You were not allowed to go on rest and relaxation to the local towns. You couldn't sit down in a cafe and have a drink next to a white person. You know, you had to be accompanied by your officers and a non-commissioned officer. There were limited places that you could go. So I think it's based on what I can tell. And white workers, by the way, were not controlled that heavily. So in my mind, this is a Jim Crow-like system that's being set up in France during World War I, not for African Americans, but for colonial troops and workers, right? So I hope that answers all your questions. We have about 10 or 20 minutes left, depending on whether people have to get out of here for classes. I got to teach at 3:50, but let's take the next 20 minutes or so if we have questions from the crowd and see what people have to say. So any questions out there in Zoom land? Yeah, Judy.
Hi, this is a great talk, Kyle, and I've been listening to versions of parts of this book for a long time now, and it's just absolutely wonderful to see it come to fruition and to hear people talking about it and the really fascinating ideas you have. I have a lot I could say about nationalism in India and the way in which colonialism is a messy and immoral system, and the nationalist movements that come into existence to oppose it are not pure. They're not, they are complicated in the way that you're trying to complicate the discussion of the Egyptian system. But I have a very small, and I'm very curious about the slide, about the petition that you showed. And the second point that was raised by the petitioners, that no English official in the service of the Egyptian government would be spared at present. What on earth did that mean? So they didn't mind if the British stayed, but they didn't like British officials. I could understand that. Anyway, that's my question.
Yeah, I mean, I'm honestly not quite sure how to interpret this second demand here. I get the sense that what they're asking for is, there's many British officials that are working in the Egyptian government at this time, and perhaps what they're asking is that these men not be enlisted into the army. And a lot of the officers of the ELC come from the ranks of British officials who are working in the government at first. When the war starts, they start recruiting officers who are familiar with Egypt, and they get a lot of them from the government. So, one way to interpret this is by saying that they want less of those British government officials to be working for the army, and maybe why is because they don't want them to be officers for the ELC. But I don't see this as being like spared from some sort of reckoning or something like that. Yeah. Lana says in the chat that spared maybe means like let go or fired, right? So they don't want the Egyptian or the English officials to be fired, and that might be one way to read it. But in the book, I really read this petition as a way to distinguish the demands of the Egyptian laborers from the demands of the nationalist movement. But in an article that's coming out in First World War Studies, I've actually kind of changed the way that I think about this. I think that you can read it in a way that's almost like, so long as you recognize that nationalism is a plural thing and it's a big tent, and there's a lot of different tendencies that can still be lumped together as Egyptian nationalism, I think it's significant that this is trying to distinguish itself from Egyptian nationalism, but there's also this line of support, right? So, is this, I think we might be able to interpret this. Number one is that the Egyptian laborers stayed connected together after the war was over, and they organized a party based on that experience. And number two, that they had a complicated relationship with nationalism, so that they could support nationalism, but also had some criticisms, right? And I just wanted to add that interpretation of the petition there. But yeah, Judy, that's a complicated thing to interpret, and I'm not sure how well my interpretation fits, but that's all I got. Andrew, what do you think?
Hey, Kyle, I just want to say first, congratulations on this huge accomplishment. I feel like I have been living with this project for years now at Cornell and after. So I'm so happy to finally see it in print. I guess one of the things that I was wondering about is how you see the book fitting into or contributing to ongoing discussions in Middle East studies when it comes to global history and mobility studies. And I'm curious about those things because I see the book really inviting us to think more critically about scale, whether in terms of the micro or the macro, and then the book really expertly tracing the circulation of ideas and of people and of materials. So any thoughts on either or both of those fronts would be great. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Andrew. And yes, Andrew was in my cohort at Cornell. And we both graduated with our PhD in the same year. So he has seen this project from the very beginning. It's been 7.5 years now since I started the research for this book. And it's great to see Andrew here, and Andrew's own book will be out soon. So looking forward to that. In terms of your question about scale and circulation, I think what I'm most excited about is seeing people take on more of a global lens as they analyze Egyptian history. One of the people who does this very well, I think, is Aaron Jakes, in the way that he connects financial crises in the United States, for example, with financial crises in Egypt, but also Bob's book, America's Kingdom. He spends the whole first part of that book in the American West, talking about how copper mines and other American mining interests set up their company towns and then kind of imported this idea to Dhahran in eastern Saudi Arabia. So what I really hope as a field is that we can break out of nationalism as a methodology and, stop ending our analyses at the borders of Egypt and start asking how what Egyptians are doing is interacting with what people around the world are doing. And I think the challenge in this is you really have to read very widely in order to understand what's going on in the rest of the world. And most of us have spent a lot of time reading everything about Egypt, and therefore we don't have time to read anything about the United States or China or Asia or the rest of Africa, you know. So I would encourage everybody to expand their reading list a little bit and you know, and zoom out a little bit. I think if there's one thing I'm trying to do, I mean, there's many things I'm trying to do, but one of the things I'm trying to do in this book is to ask what might be some other kind of geographies that we can think about Egyptians as being enmeshed in besides the nation or the empire. And I think the Egyptian labor corps itself provides a kind of alternative geography with Egyptians in Gallipoli and France and Italy and Palestine and Iraq and Sudan and Libya. And so that's one of the things I'm really excited about with this book. So thanks, Andrew. What about Robert Mevison? I see your hand up. Robert, go for it.
You actually just touched on your last topic. The two other words you have in your subtitle are place and space, and you mentioned a few places. And I'm really curious about how some of these places, some of these spaces, did they influence the interactions that the Egyptian labor corps had with other people that helped formulate these ideas? Or what role did these play? I mean, I apologize, I've not yet read the book, Kyle. I'm really excited to read it. But what role are these playing in this formulation of race that you were also talking about? Are they as critical for these ideas? Is it the exchanges in certain places or the creation of certain spaces? Or why do you have those in your title?
Well, so the title is more about I borrowed it from a critical race theorist named Keith Aoki, the late Keith Aoki, and it's basically a model of how ideas about race become politically meaningful because they influence spatial change, right? So the idea that experiences of segregation, forced migration, uneven resource distribution, geographically speaking, all of these things are influenced by ideas about race, and so that impacts people's experiences and it causes them to start identifying with one another. So even though ideas about race, let's say Egyptians as being part of a unique race, in my mind, this originally did not describe reality. But as time went on, people came to internalize this notion of race because of the fact that they had to live in certain spaces that had been created and organized by authority figures who were very much thinking in terms of race. And you know, segregation, uneven resource distribution, forced movement, all those things I talked about. And as to whether, you know, the interactions between different spaces, I think the biggest thing that I talk about in the beginning of the book is how ideas about military labor evolved throughout the 1700s and the 1800s in different places, like in the Americas or in South Africa or in West Africa or even in Sudan, and then how these ideas get kind of imported into Egypt during World War I, so that, you know, it wasn't in World War I that the British first came to think about specific races as being appropriate for specific kinds of military labor. They worked that idea out elsewhere, like in India with the martial races theory that I'm sure Judy knows very well, right? And then they import that back into Egypt during World War I. They say, well, these Egyptians, you know, we know that, if I'm speaking as a British guy now, we know that people of color in India are good at these jobs. So Egyptians are also people of color. So therefore, they should also be good at these jobs, right? And that's the kind of logic that I think the British were using when they created the ELC. And I think that's why this notion of the global color line is the best way to think about what the ELC represents.
Thank you so much. That's, yeah, really fascinating scholarship. And I just want to reiterate what other people in the department have said. It's wonderful to hear this outpouring of you know, just wonderful reception, that everyone is really excited because it reflects well on you.
Well, thanks, Robert. Pete.
Hey, so just echoing all the excellent congratulations. Looks, I have also not read the book yet, but this looks like a fascinating study that I can't wait to get my hands on. So huge props to putting this out there. And I know these things are many years in the making, so it's a big day. We're very proud of you, Kyle. Not so short question. I'll try to keep it contained. I guess my question would be, having not had a chance to spend some time with the book, is I guess I'm really intrigued with sort of the angle of racialization, racial formation, or deformation that you're which is one of the main streams that you're talking to here in your work. And some of the debate around those things at a more sort of abstract or theoretical level often, they point to the fact that racialization and economic subjugation are two sort of separate and independent things that don't necessarily require the other. However, racialization attempts have often been found to be more durable when they combine or are combined with or used to subjugate groups of people who are being put into certain economic modes of subjugation, to perform certain types of labor, to often be coerced or to be excluded from remunerative forms of labor. That there's a certain bad mutual reinforcement of racialization processes and economic hierarchies. So I'm curious about sort of regular non-wartime Egypt. To what extent first were these new racialization attempts of Egyptian laborers durable back once the war ended? Did they have a sort of shelf life to them? And if yes, or if not, to what extent do you see those outcomes as determined by the structure of both the Egyptian internal economy and its role within a larger world economy in the British Empire, et cetera? Probably way too much to answer in the whatever 5 minutes we have remaining, but just a question out there.
Yeah. Okay. So that's a really important question. One of the things that when I first started writing this book, I was really focused on political economy because, as Bob mentioned, that's kind of the big method and mode that people use to write Egyptian history, generally speaking. But I chose to talk about World War I because I just thought this story was so fascinating. And as I dove into it more, I started to realize that this wasn't necessarily a story about economics, right? That the war represented of course, one could argue that the war itself was fought for economic reasons, as Lenin did, but others take a different approach, and I tend not to be a Leninist the way that I think about these things. I think that war itself, we have to recognize that war itself is also a really important way in which identities are formed and structured and crystallized. And also, particularly, one of the things I argue in the book is that war is really important when it comes to the production of space, right? So oftentimes when you see critical geographers like David Harvey or Henri Lefebvre talking about the production of space, they're talking about capitalism and how the capitalist mode of production creates urbanization, right? But also urbanization is contributed to by wars, right? And when wars are fought, urban space is reconfigured, and it doesn't necessarily have anything to do with the economy or financial motivations. It has to do with the war, right? So I think that's one of the main points that I'm trying to make in the book. And I think, that kind of dovetails with your question about how did these racial formations get institutionalized in the economic sphere. And I think, one of the things that you said that was kind of a interesting word for me was you said, what does this look like in regular non-wartime Egypt, right? And I think that one of the problems is that there is no non-wartime Egypt, right? Like Egypt is always, first off, when the British first take over in Egypt, immediately after there's a rebellion in the Sudan, which is directly south of Egypt. The Mahdist Wars is what it's called. So this guy comes to power, he calls himself the Mahdi, he takes over in Sudan, and the British spend the next 15, 16 years or so fighting wars in the Sudan from their base in Egypt to reconquer the Sudan, right? And then there is a brief 12, 14-year period of time, and then World War I starts back up again. But throughout the process, I think one of the points that I'm trying to make is that wars are going on a lot more frequently than just the particular flashpoints that we might associate with World War I, for example, right? And so I think that, and that's something that a lot of people ignore when they're talking about Egypt, right? The fact that the Sudan is there to the south, the fact that Egypt is a major base for these wars in the Sudan. But then your question about, how does racial formation get kind of institutionalized in the sphere of the economy. I think that there's a couple interesting answers to that. One thing that I talk about in chapter 2 of the book is how Egypt's main export was cotton, right? And so there were plantations, it was a plantation-based economy. And in the 19th century, you had a lot of Black African slaves actually working at these plantations. That gets outlawed in the 1870s, and it's basically done by 1900. But you still have kind of coercive labor practices that are going on in the plantations that I think, put Egyptians in a position, especially rural Egyptians, the fellahin, kind of puts them in a position analogous to those Black African slaves who are now not allowed to be drawn on anymore. And I think this is very similar to kind of how Cedric Robinson talks about racial capitalism in a sense, right? How Robinson's argument is that capitalism builds off of inequalities in Europe that are based off of ideas about blood. And so the spreading of capitalism in Robinson's mind from Europe to the rest of the world kind of exports this racial order in Europe to the rest of the world, right? That's Cedric Robinson's argument as the way that I see it. And my problem with Robinson's argument is that it's very Eurocentric, right? And it assumes that Europe was uniquely a place in which blood mattered, and that in the rest of the world, it's only with the coming of capitalism that these blood type relationships get hardened and institutionalized. But I think that, what Egyptian historians can contribute to the story about racial capitalism is like people were being exploited on the basis of their perceived, descent and parentage, and their phenotypical variation even in Egypt long before colonialism ever got there, long before European colonialism ever got there, right? So I think I can subscribe to an idea of racial capitalism, but it would have to be an idea that takes into account the fact that ideas about race were not unique to Europe, and that especially I think in the Muslim world, it was also a place in which sort of, exploitation on the basis of perceived descent and parentage and phenotypical variation was also very common in the Muslim world, right? And so I think that Robinson's theory of racial capitalism would have a hard time accounting for that. And there's other work by people like Miriam Halla-Davis right now that is talking about racial capitalism in the Middle East. And so I think that's kind of a interesting direction to see how that goes.
I just want to say thank you. I have to head out to teach right now, but great job. I really enjoyed it.
Thanks. I also have to teach, so I got to call an end to this, but I want to thank you all for joining. And if you haven't gotten a copy yet, get a copy of the book. And I hope to discuss it with all of you when I see you next. So thanks again.